discovering which American companies are the oldest reveals an intriguing historical journey. These businesses, which range from colonial-era institutions to surviving family legacies, have withstood centuries of transition and represent resiliency and legacy in the modern business environment. Despite wars, depressions, recessions, and slumps, some companies have positioned themselves in the market to stand the test of time. Today, we have prepared a list of the top 8 oldest companies in the United States history. Number 8. Pabst Brewing Company. The history of the Pabst Brewing Company can be traced to 1842 when Jacob Best, Jr. and his brother, Charles Best, immigrated to America from Mettenheim, Germany. Once they arrived in Milwaukee, they began a small vinegar works and seeing the possibilities in the fledgling frontier town. In 1844, Jacob Best Sr. created the brewery of Best & Company with his 4 sons. Production in these early days consisted only of 300 barrels per annum. In 1850, Charles and Lawrence Best left the family business to start their own brewery, which they named the Plank Road Brewery and eventually became known as the Miller Brewing Company when it was purchased by Frederick Miller. Jacob Best Sr. retired in 1853, and by 1859 Philip was the sole proprietor, thus changing the name to the Philip Best Brewing Company. Best's eldest daughter, Maria, met Frederick Pabst in 1860 and married him 2 years later. In 1864, Pabst purchased a half interest in the brewing company for $21,057 and became vice president. After the marriage of Best's youngest daughter, Lisette, in 1866, her husband, Emile Chandine, essentially purchased the remaining half interest in the company from Philip Best. Production of beer had reached 14,139 barrels by 1866. Philip Best died shortly thereafter in 1869. The year 1873 was a milestone for the company when the brewery was legally incorporated and capitalized at $300,000 with a production of 100,593 barrels per year. Pabst and Chandine both had an astute understanding of the business and, more importantly, marketing. The company became known for always embracing the latest technology in production. Artificial ice machines were added in 1880, incandescent lights in 1882, and Philip Best Brewing Company was one of the first breweries to open itself for public tours. Chandine died in July of 1888 while on holiday in Germany, leaving Pabst in complete control of the brewing and real estate empire. The company's name remained the same until March 12, 1889, when the name was officially changed to the Pabst Brewing Company. The 1893 Columbian Exposition, also known as the 1893 World's Fair, was held in Chicago and became a significant event in American history. The Pabst Brewing Company hired Milwaukee architect Otto Strack to design a trade pavilion just for this event. Located in the fair's agricultural building, the pavilion was used to display Pabst Brewing Company products. Within the pavilion's interior stood a 13-square-foot model of the Pabst Brewing Company's buildings atop an elaborate platform supported by gnomes. The model, originally washed in gold, is said to have cost Captain Pabst $100,000 and was highly regarded at the fair for its beauty of presentation. The entire structure was constructed of tan terracotta emblazoned with symbols of the brewing industry, including hop vines, beer steins, and the god and goddess of barley and hops. The exterior was also highlighted with gold leaf and crowned by a magnificent art glass dome. In November of 1893, the Pabst Brewing Company was presented with a certificate for brewing excellence at the exposition, not the often-thought blue ribbon. After the fair, Captain Pabst had the entire structure dismantled, crated, sent to his Milwaukee residence, and rebuilt as a private conservatory. Captain Pabst was not content being the leader of the world's largest brewing company. Rather, he was keenly interested in developing new avenues to not only market his product, but also enhance the image of Pabst beer on a national scale. He was one of the first executives to understand and utilize national advertising campaigns. More importantly, Pabst realized that he needed to make his product and insignia available and visible everywhere. He managed this by creating a real estate empire that stretched from coast to coast, border to border. Over a period of 25 years, hundreds upon hundreds of Pabst taverns or tied houses were created and leased all over the country. These tied houses were to serve Pabst Brewing Co.'s products exclusively and display the Pabst logo proudly. The red circle and hop leaf emblem was to be seen in every major American city by 1900. Real estate was considered to be a sound investment, and Pabst Brewing Company staked its reputation on it. Number 7. Citigroup. The Citibank of New York was founded on June 16, 1812. In 1831, Citibank was the site of one of America's first bank heists when two burglars, James Honeyman and William J. Murray, made off with tens of thousands of dollars worth of banknotes and 398 gold doubloons, the equivalent of $82 million in today's economy. The bank financed war bonds for the War of 1812, serving as a founding member of the Financial Clearinghouse in New York, underwriting the Union during the American Civil War with $50 million in war bonds, opening the first foreign exchange department of any bank. In 1865, the bank joined the national banking system of the United States under the National Bank Act and became the National City Bank of New York. By 1868, it was one of the largest banks in the United States. The bank became the largest bank in New York City after the Panic of 1893 and the largest bank in the U.S. by 1895. It helped finance the Panama Canal in 1904. By 1906, 11% of the federal government's bank balances were held by National City. National City at this time was the banker of Standard Oil. Between 1910 and 1911, the Department of State backed a consortium of American investors headed by Citibank to acquire control over the sole commercial bank of Haiti. By 1919, the bank had become the first U.S. bank to have $1 billion in assets. Charles E. Mitchell, also called Sunshine Charlie Mitchell, was elected president in 1921. In 1929, he was made chairman, a position he held until 1933. Under Mitchell, the bank expanded rapidly and by 1930 had 100 branches in 23 countries outside the United States. The policies pursued by the bank under Mitchell's leadership are seen by many people as one of the prime causes of the stock market crash of 1929, which led ultimately to the Great Depression. The company organically entered the leasing and credit card sectors, and its introduction of U.S. dollar-denominated certificates of deposit in London marked the first new negotiable instrument in the market since 1888. Later to become part of MasterCard, the bank introduced its first National City Charge Service credit card, popularly known as the Everything Card. In 1967, First National City Bank reorganized as a one-bank holding company, First National City Corporation, or Citicorp for short. However, the bank had been nicknamed Citibank since the 1860s, when Citibank of New York adopted it as an 8-letter wire code address. Citicorp became the holding company's formal name in 1974, and in 1976, First National City Bank was renamed Citibank. The name change also helped to avoid confusion in Ohio with Cleveland-based National City Corp., though the banks never had any significant overlapping areas except for city credit cards issued in National City territory. In addition, at the time of the name change to Citicorp, in 1968, National City of Ohio was mostly a Cleveland area bank and had not gone on its acquisition spree that would occur in the 1990s and 2000s. In 1987, the bank set aside $3 billion in reserves for loan losses in Brazil and other developing countries. In 1990, the bank established a subsidiary in Poland. In 1994, it became the world's biggest card issuer. Number 6. Remington Ammunition. It was 1816 when Eliphalet Remington founded what is America's oldest gunmaker. From those modest beginnings, filling orders for flintlocks that impressed so many at a shooting competition, the company has evolved, grown, changed hands, branched out into a variety of other products, and ultimately sold off in pieces. Its journey into the world of ammunition production really began in 1888 when investors, who also happened to own United Metallic Cartridge, purchased Remington. The marriage of sorts was a profitable one, and in 1912 the companies consolidated under the name Remington UMC. In 1933, DuPont added a wealth of chemical manufacturing knowledge to the mix when it acquired a 60% stake in the company. The next year, Remington purchased Peters Cartridge and gained even more traction in the ammunition market. Demand was quickly outstripping capacity by the 1960s. It began operation in 1969. Today, the facility stands on 1,200 acres, and the buildings alone cover 750,000 square feet. Business boomed, and Remington-branded ammunition quickly became a favorite among shooters. DuPont, having witnessed the growth, purchased the other 40% of the company in 1980. 13 years later, Remington sold to Rossi Acquisitions, a New York investment firm. Then, Cerberus Capital Management acquired Remington in 2007 and spun it into its Freedom Group of companies in 2010. Meanwhile, top brands in the gun industry were also purchased and added to the growing stable of firms, including DPMS, Bushmaster, and many others. Despite the acquisitions, in March 2018, Remington Outdoor Company filed for bankruptcy protection. Improvements in the Arkansas factory, which were long overdue, never materialized. Remington orchestrated a financial reorganization in a shockingly short time, but it continued to struggle. Rounds of layoffs followed, production stalled, and it finally filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy in July of 2020. Its various companies were sold to different high bidders at auctions. News that a company with 100 years of expertise in manufacturing cartridges and components was a welcome relief to the employees and community. New life breathed into the firm with the sale. Number 5. Macy's. Born in 1822, R.H. Macy, the son of a Nantucket-based shopkeeper, left home at 15 to set sail on the whaling ship Emily Morgan. After 4 years at sea, he returned to Massachusetts and worked in his father's shop before opening his own needle and thread store in Boston in 1844. This shop failed, as did another dry goods store he opened 2 years later. Macy then worked for a time in his brother-in-law's Boston shop, followed by a stint in California searching for gold during the 1849 gold rush. After that effort proved disappointing, he came back to Massachusetts and, in 1851, opened yet another dry goods store in downtown Haverhill in partnership with his brother. Though they experienced modest success, Macy left Haverhill for New York City in 1858 to open his own fancy dry goods store, R.H. Macy and Company, on the corner of 14th Street and 6th Avenue, a low-rent district north of the city's other dry goods stores. On the first day of operation, the store pulled in $11.06, and sales continued to grow at a robust pace, with gross returns for the ensuing year totaling around $85,000. Over time, Macy expanded his operation to occupy 11 adjacent buildings, selling many different categories of merchandise, and effectively launched what came to be known as a department store. The store's original trademark emblem was a rooster, but Macy replaced it with a red star, inspired by the tattoo he got on his forearm during his whaling days, a visual nod to the star that guided him when he was at sea. R.H. Macy's success resulted in large part from his innovative sales and advertising practices that virtually transformed the retail industry and prompted customers to flock to the store for unrivaled shopping experiences. In addition, Macy's store was the first to possess a New York City liquor license, and in 1862, the first to feature a Santa Claus during the Christmas season. In 1864, the store began installing illuminated window displays to attract the attention of those passing by, giving rise to the notion of window shopping. R.H. Macy died in 1877, and in 1895, the company ownership passed from his family to Isidore and Nathan Strauss, brothers who, with their father, had leased the basement of the store in 1874 and established a famous china department there. The Strauss family continued to build on R.H. Macy's legacy of firsts throughout the early years of the 20th century. In 1902, the operation moved uptown to the 9-story Herald Square flagship building at 34th Street and Broadway. It had 33 elevators and 4 wooden escalators, the first to be used in any American store. These original escalators can still be seen today in the Herald Square store. Over the years, R.H. Macy and Company went public, opened regional stores, took over competing retail outlets, and in 1994 was itself acquired by Federated Department Stores, which had operated hundreds of stores across 37 states, and with this purchase became the largest department store retailer in America. The online Macy's, Macys.com, was launched in 1997, significantly broadening the company's reach. In 2007, Federated Department Stores changed its corporate name to Macy's Inc. and now has over 600 stores across the United States. Number 4, J.P. Morgan Chase. J.P. Morgan Chase & Company is one of the world's oldest and largest financial institutions. As a global financial services firm with operations in more than 60 countries, JP Morgan Chase serves millions of consumers, small businesses, and many of the world's most prominent corporate, institutional, and government clients. Tracing its roots to 1799, the firm is built on the foundation of more than 1,200 predecessor institutions that have come together over the years to form today's company. From its earliest roots as a water company, JPM Morgan Chase has been intimately connected to the United States Postal Service. Both the firm and the Postal Service have grown together over the last 200 years, contributing to each other's success along the way. The firm quickly became known for its ability to identify profitable American investments, particularly in the expanding railroad system. In 1880, Morgan financed the completion of the Northern Pacific Railroad, linking Montana with the Pacific coast. This financing was at the time the largest transaction in railroad bonds ever made in the United States. By the early 20th century, J.P. Morgan and Company, one of J.P. Morgan Chase's major predecessors, was the preeminent private bank in the United States and involved in some of the nation's largest deals. One of these deals came in 1901 when J.P. Morgan and Company bought out American industrialist Andrew Carnegie's Steel Company and combined nearly 36 other companies to create United States Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. In its first full year in operation, U.S. Steel controlled over half of all America's steelmaking capacity. In 1915, J.P. Morgan and Company arranged the largest foreign loan in Wall Street history, a $500 million loan to aid the French and British governments during the war. The firm also acted as the purchasing agent in the United States for the European allies, placing over $3 billion worth of contracts with American producers for weapons, ammunition, and other goods needed during the war. The Roaring Twenties was a time of domestic and global expansion for many J.P. Morgan Chase predecessors. As the banks grew, so too did their volume of incoming and outgoing mail. Chase Manhattan Bank introduced the Chase Manhattan Charge Plan in 1958, becoming the first New York City bank to offer customers a retail charge account. This account provided customers with credit at a citywide network of stores, rejecting the need for charge accounts with individual retailers. In 1963, the United States Postal Service initiated the zip code, or the Zoning Improvement Plan, to better address the demand for more efficient mail services. By 2009, J.P. Morgan Chase was the leading cash management provider to the U.S. Postal Service. J.P. Morgan Chase continues to expand throughout the world, guided by many of the same principles which also govern the U.S. Postal Service. These principles, a strong sense of accountability, and a commitment to responsible, honest work, have allowed both to remain connected to their customers and the communities they serve. Number 3, Jim Beam. The history of Jim Beam whiskey can be traced back to 1788. The Beams family, originally from Germany, resided in central Kentucky and changed their name to Beam. Using 100 acres of his land, Jacob Beam made a corn-based whiskey bourbon using his father's recipe. He named it Old Jake Beam Sour Mash, what would later be known as Jim Beam whiskey. The bourbon was first sold in 1795 and was an instant hit. Old Jake Beam Sour Mash quickly became a favorite with the locals. The liquor was popular among farmers, traders, and pioneers. Jacob Beam later passed on the family business to his son, David Beam, who then expanded the distillery and named it Old Tub Distillery. The company began to change its liquor production method by using column stills and charred barrels to age the spirit. He also used steamboats and railroads to spread the whiskey bourbon nationwide. His son, David M. Beam, extended the brand even more by moving the distillery near rail and telegraph lines, a location that allowed a much further reach. It was at James Beauregard Beam's generation when the alcohol prohibition was commenced. It was illegal to make alcohol at that time, and sales at the distillery went downhill. James was forced into other businesses, such as quarrying and farming. But luckily, it didn't last long. When he was in his late 60s, the ban was lifted, and with new determination, he and his family and friends began to rebuild the distillery in Claremont in just 120 days. The brand was changed from Old Jake Beam Sour Mash to Jim Beam Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey or Jim Beam Whiskey, and the distillery became James B. Beam Distilling Company. The iconic Jim Beam is based on James Beauregard Beam, and the hand signature on the bottle is his. The legendary Beam in the history of the whiskey bourbon family business. The Jim Beam whiskey brand began to spread across the world under the leadership of T. Jeremiah Beam. Eventually, it was passed on to Fred Booker No Scent, the grandson of Jim Beam. Fred kept his family tradition and refused to change from making bourbon to vodka. Fred introduced the small batch bourbon collections to revitalize the declining bourbon sales. The small batch whiskey was a new idea at that time, and it successfully increased Jim Beam whiskey's popularity. Other companies soon began to follow his step and release their own small batch variations. Now, in their 7th generation, the current master distiller is Fred No. He maintains his family tradition and introduces Jim Beam whiskey to even more people. Number 2, Baker's Chocolate. In 1764, John Hannon and the American physician Dr. James Baker started importing beans and producing chocolate in the Lower Mills section of Dorchester, Massachusetts. After Hannon never returned from a 1779 sailing trip to the West Indies to purchase cocoa beans, his wife sold the company to Baker in 1780, and the company was renamed to the Baker Chocolate Company. His first product was a cake of chocolate for making a sweetened chocolate drink. Distribution was mainly in the northeastern United States until 1804, when James Baker's son, Edmund Baker, inherited the family business and increased production with a state-of-the-art mill. The original brand name was Hannon's Best Chocolate, which was manufactured for almost 15 years and was sold with a money-back guarantee if the consumer was unsatisfied with the product. By 1849, under Walter Baker, the Baker's Chocolate brand had spread to California during the Gold Rush era. Production was limited to one kind of chocolate until 1852, when employee Samuel German created German's sweet chocolate that had a higher sugar content than previous baking chocolates. In 1957, a Dallas, Texas newspaper printed a cake recipe for German's chocolate cake based on this chocolate, which was reprinted by the company's owner, General Foods, under the German chocolate cake, becoming the accepted name. Production steadily increased through the century. The trademark logo of La Belle Chocolatière was adopted in 1883 by the 4th-generation familial owner Henry L. Pierce, step-nephew of Walter Baker. Pierce began advertising Baker's Chocolate heavily in newspapers to increase sales. In 1896, Baker's Chocolate was advertising in around 8,000 newspapers in the United States. The company also advertised using signage and cards in grocery stores, in novels, in streetcars, and using billboards. Promotional offers of tableware and logo pins helped attract customers. Around the late 1800s, the company began promoting the notion of using chocolate as an ingredient in desserts and for baking. Following Pierce's death in 1896, the Forbes Syndicate bought the company, which they sold in 1927 to the Postum Cereal Company, later known as General Foods. In 1966, production moved from Dorchester, Massachusetts to Dover, Delaware. The company was passed on to Kraft Foods in 1989 when they acquired General Foods. Baker's is now owned by Kraft Heinz, a company formed by the merger between Kraft Foods and Heinz. Number 1. The Hartford Courant. This is a source for news and history unlike any other. The paper not only kept readers around the country informed on important local, national, and international events for over 2.5 centuries, but access to its well-preserved archival resources provides important insight into life in the United States, dating back to its very conception. Founded prior to American independence, the Hartford Courant is the country's oldest newspaper in continuous publication. On October 29, 1764, New Haven printer Thomas Green began publishing the Hartford Courant out of the Heart and Crown Tavern in Hartford, Connecticut. His first issue consisted of just 4 pages, but Green saw it as the first step toward his goal of informing the world about the important events of his time. Green came from a family of printers, and his new weekly paper became just the 3rd newspaper available in the Connecticut colony. Green sold advertising space in the Courant in return for cash or produce, and supplemented the paper's revenues by selling clothing, hardware, and spices out in front of his office. While Green reliably published a new edition every Monday, the actual size of the paper varied from week to week based on the supply of paper available. Paper shortages were a common occurrence throughout the colonial era, and Green often asked his readers to save their linen and cotton rags for use in paper production. Green eventually sold the Connecticut Courant to his assistant Ebenezer Watson, and Watson promptly addressed the paper shortage problem by building his own paper mill nearby. When Watson died from smallpox in 1777, his widow, Hannah Bunce Watson, took control of the paper, becoming one of the first female publishers in America. The Connecticut Current played a very important role in keeping readers abreast of events transpiring during the colonial period. The paper provided detailed coverage of colonial reaction to the Stamp Act, the Boston Tea Party, and on July 15, 1776, the paper published a copy of the Declaration of Independence in its entirety. The Current soon became the most widely circulated newspaper in the colonies, and so important to provide coverage of the Revolutionary War that when the local paper mill burned to the ground, the Connecticut legislature authorized a lottery to pay for its reconstruction. In the years that followed the war, the paper maintained its prominent position in American culture. While the Current continued to offer a weekly edition of its paper right up until 1896, on September 12, 1837, it supplemented its news coverage with a new daily edition, the first daily newspaper in Hartford. During this time, the paper not only covered important events and ran advertisements for suppliers of goods and services, but reflected the strong pro-slavery sentiments that existed in Connecticut by running ads meant to aid in the capture of fugitive slaves. Though slavery maintained deep roots in Connecticut, the paper stopped running these advertisements by the time state legislators abolished slavery in 1848. In 1913, with its daily edition in high demand, the paper published its first ever Sunday edition. Throughout the decades that followed, Connecticut residents repeatedly turned to the Hartford Courant for coverage of the military conflicts erupting across the globe, the rapid commercial and political transformations occurring at home, and the country's foray into outer space. The steady growth of the paper in the 20th century eventually caught the eye of a Los Angeles-based media company called Times Mirror, and in 1979, amid a flurry of media outlet mergers, Times Mirror purchased the paper. The years that followed witnessed the paper's staff grow to a high of just under 400 employees in 1994. In 2000, the Chicago-based Tribune Company purchased Times Mirror. With a background in television, radio, and publishing, Tribune helped the Hartford Courant maintain its credibility among the frenzy of new media outlets that emerged in the digital age. Today, as it continues to navigate the changing media landscape, its recently digitized archives offer researchers and historians a first-hand look at the evolving American landscape over the past 250 years.